Welcome to this video training on the C-IAYT scope of practice for yoga therapists. After watching the video and passing a brief quiz, 1 CE credit will be automatically applied to your profile. The learning objectives for this video are to understand the background behind the C-IAYT scope of practice for yoga therapists and review key concepts in the scope of practice for yoga therapists to consider to stay within the boundaries in which they are properly trained or qualified. This video is produced by and for C-IAYTs. Over the course of the video, you will meet members of the C-IAYT Ethics Training Task Force and additional volunteers discussing various aspects of the scope of practice. Let's meet the Ethics Training Task Force. Nancy Sinton and Kelly Froyo, C-IAYT staff, Beth Gibbs, Zipporah Gerson-Miller, and Sarah Greco, all volunteers. The task force chose 5 topic areas to discuss and invited yoga therapists experienced in these subjects to provide their perspectives. The video begins with Beth Gibbs interviewing Amy Wheeler about the background on the C-IAYT scope of practice. From there, we hear a conversation with Leanne Davis and Jenny Lee Sneed on the topic of consented touch in yoga therapy training, teaching, and practice. Next is a discussion between Sarah Greco and Zipporah Gerson-Miller, explaining the difference between practicing as a trauma-informed versus trauma-trained yoga therapists and how to stay within our boundaries. Chara Carruthers educates us on staying within our scope of practice in regards to nutrition and lifestyle. We conclude with Beth Gibbs interviewing Laura Cooperman on the subject of C-IAYT business practices. Let's start with the background on the C-IAYT scope of practice.
Hello, Amy, and thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed for this segment of our program. And we're going to be talking about the scope of practice. So I think my first question is going to be, what is a scope of practice? How would you define that?
Scope of practice for yoga and yoga therapy is to tell us where the bounds of our profession are. What makes yoga therapy unique? How do we define ourselves to the outside world, to all the other healthcare providers and all the other professions out there? So it's putting a boundary around who we are, what we do, and how we do it. But I think in the case of C-IAYT, it's also been a really great exercise for us to, in these early emerging phases of this profession, to define to ourselves, who are we? Who do we want to become? So I think for most professions, it's telling the outside world who you are and what are the boundaries. But I think in our case, the way that we developed it, it was a very good svadhyaya or self-reflection about who are we?
Mm-hmm. And how, if you want to add any more, I guess to be more specific, was how would it help? How does the scope of practice help identify procedures, actions, and processes that a yoga therapist is permitted to perform?
Well, we have a very beautiful document called the Scope of Practice document that has 2 columns. And in one column, these are all the things we can do. And in the second column, here's all the things we cannot do. And it's broken down very clearly in our Scope of Practice document. And that's just so helpful, because when you see in the column that says, do not do this, something like, do not diagnose. We are not here to diagnose. That is really important, because when we talk to healthcare providers out there, we are not practicing medicine. So we want to make sure that they know that we know that we're not diagnosing. So that's one example of really helping us all have clarity. And that's what this is about, on what we can do and what we cannot do.
Good. And can you give us just a little bit of history of when this actually came into being for C-IAYT?
Sure. I would say the seed of it started back in 2007 when IAYT decided to participate in something called self-regulation. And basically what that means is we don't want the states or the federal government to come in and regulate us in the early phases of our development as a field. So we're going to practice self-regulation and do all the things that really solid professions do. We're going to create a code of ethics. We're going to create a scope of practice, leaving the door open in the long haul to determine if we want licensure, but also saying, even without a license, we're acting responsibly. We're taking care of people. We are making sure people are not harmed. So that whole idea started in 2007. And just to see, it took about 9 years to get everything in order to actually have a document that we released to our members, that the board had approved, that the committees had carefully crafted and gone through for a couple of years, and then finally put ourselves out to the world in about spring of 2016. And one thing I want to say about that is very few yoga organizations in the world had taken that step at that time. It was kind of a big deal to say, here's who we are, when there was so much I wouldn't say confusion about what yoga versus yoga therapy is, but it needed to be clear.
Exactly. And it's important to have that information and that declination between the confusion that's out there, but to have the clarity, I think is wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about why a scope of practice is needed?
I think it's to keep everyone safe. The clients, of course, we want to keep them safe. We don't want to be doing things that would harm them. That's one of our first principles of the yamas is ahimsa, or non-harming. But I would also argue that it is to keep ourselves safe. There are some things we just don't know what we don't know. We just assume, oh, I should be able to do this, out of lack of clarity. So it's keeping the client safe, but it's also keeping ourselves safe from harming ourselves when we just don't know any better. And then the third thing it's doing is it's keeping our profession safe. Because we are such a budding or emerging profession, we can't handle a lot of big scandals or problems right now. We need to stay straight and narrow with integrity and show the world who we are and that we are an amazing profession. And so it sounds sad, but at such an early phase like this, if one person makes a big mistake, it can reflect on the whole field. So we want to keep ourselves as a field safe too.
Exactly. And does this also apply to a situation that would the scope of practice protect a yoga therapist from any legal difficulties?
Well, we are not bound legally by the scope of practice, but if we were to get drawn into a lawsuit, they would be looking at best practices. They would be looking at the guidelines set out by the IAYT in terms of scope of practice, in terms of ethics, and that is what we would be judged by. So even though it's not a legally binding document, we might as well kind of assume that it is, because if we end up in court, that's what the court is going to look at.
And if a yoga therapist does not follow the scope of practice, what could happen? Are there any sanctions or disciplinary actions that IAYT has in place for that?
Yes. So a C-IAYT, a certified
C-IAYT.
yoga therapist, right? Because there's a lot of people out there just calling themselves certified yoga therapists, but let's say a C-IAYT. If I did not follow the scope of practice, I absolutely could have a complaint leveled against me and go through the entire disciplinary process so that IAYT could help me come to understand where I've had a blind spot. And I think that's really important. The essence of what I've seen IAYT doing both in scope of practice and ethics has not been a punishment model. It has been, let us keep each other safe. Let us help each other understand where we've gone off track and let us correct that together. And to me, that is very comforting, that knowing that if I do get off track and I just did something that I didn't know any better, for example, there's something in our code of ethics about not receiving kickbacks financially. So if I get somebody some business, I can't take money back from them because I got them that business. A lot of people don't understand that's a problem. So they might, get in trouble for that, but it would just be a learning moment and cleaned up and moving on.
Right, thank you. And can you tell me or talk a little bit about how the scope of practice complements the code of ethics?
I think the two are so beautifully married to one another, because we have the code of ethics in the 3 columns, taking care of clients, taking care of the profession. We have all of that laid out. And then we say specifically, please do not touch people in this way, but you can touch them in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think you have a whole episode on touch. Yes. Please do not diagnose, but you can assess, right? So I think the two are just helping to give each other clarity, because there is a lot of gray area that all of us are still learning together what is appropriate for a profession and what is not.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you have not yet mentioned that you think would be very important for a yoga therapist to understand about the scope of practice?
I think the more self-analysis we can do, especially in a safe container, like as a continuing education course, or as a Sangha, if you have a Sangha that you work with, kind of working through sticky vignettes of, okay, here's the, excuse me, working through vignettes where here's the situation that we have. How would you handle that? What does the scope of practice say about that? And what does the code of ethics say about that? And where do you need to go from here? So I think it's a continuous process of learning. It's not something that we just take a quiz and we're done for the next 2 years. I think we need to keep revisiting and reviewing over and over again.
That's sound advice to me. And as we conclude, I'd like to ask if there's anything else that you would like to add or mention before we end our time together today.
Yes, I think that the field of yoga for many, many years, and still the field of yoga, doesn't really have a scope of practice, whereas yoga therapy, according to C-IAYT, does. And the reason it was so critical for C-IAYT to lead on this and to develop one before most other yoga organizations is because we're moving into allied health profession. And there is this very specific idea of therapeutic relationship involved. And that puts us in a whole different category. Those two things put us in a different category than teaching a group yoga class as more of a fitness experience. So I really think we have to know that therapeutic relationship is why so much safety is needed and why we've developed both the code of ethics and the scope of practice.
Thank you. That is a very good explanation that I think will help anyone who's watching this video. So thank you very much, Amy. It's been a pleasure to talk with you about this subject.
Thank you, Beth. It's been my pleasure.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Leanne Davis, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. And today I've got the great privilege of spending some time with Dr. Jenny Lee Sneed from California. And we're going to have a chat about the segment of the scope of practice that relates specifically to consented touch. So thanks for joining us, Jenny Lee. And perhaps we could start off with considering what is the value of touch in yoga therapy? Why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, so for many different schools of yoga therapy, touch can be a very important intervention in their practice. I know my background is in Phoenix Rising, where touch is one of our key interventions that we sometimes use with clients.
And it's different for different traditions, isn't it? And different training. So some yoga therapy approaches are very somatic, aren't they? And there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of skills given in that area of their training, where personally I came from a tradition where we don't touch so much, and so there is limited training. So it's important that we all understand, isn't it, that whatever we're doing is relevant to our education levels. And so that information is available to us in the policy that came along in 2020 to C-IAYT, when the scope of practice was updated to include more information on touch consent. And what led to that, Jenny Lee? How did that come about?
Yeah, so at that point in time, there were many survivors coming forward talking about the, unethical and abusive touch that they had experienced within yoga. And so IAYT saw that and realized how important it was to create this policy so that for practitioners who are using touch, that we're using it in ways that are ethical for our clients.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And really, throughout the world, yoga therapy is an evolving profession, isn't it? And it's really important that our professional bodies keep up to date with things as they come to our attention. How did that come about then? Like, who makes these policies? Where do they come from?
Yeah, so IAYT, they formed a touch committee. I was on that along with Kathleen Pringle and Dr. Jamie Stover-Schmidt. And so the three of us met very regularly for several months to help create the policy that IAYT now has on touch. And all three of us came from schools that use touch within our yoga therapy practice. And, as you mentioned earlier, not all schools teach touch. And so, of course, if you are using touch, you need to have that training and that competency to use it.
Yeah. And thank you. Thank you. It's an important part of how our associations work, isn't it? That volunteers from within our profession or advisors come together to help us bring these forward. So thank you for that time. And where can our members see this now? Where do we find this policy if we're not familiar with it yet?
Well, it is on the IAYT website. And I believe at the end of all these training videos, they'll be sent links to the various documents referenced. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And I think at the time, actually, some people might have noticed that IAYT did produce a statement to let everyone know that this was happening. And I do know that it was very well received and timely throughout the world. It was a great contribution to the profession. So it's good for us to consider, what does consent actually mean? What are we talking about when we talk about consent?
Yeah. So consent means that somebody is willingly saying yes to something happening. And so part of that is the need for informed consent within our practice, which means that our clients or our students are informed of how touch is used in our practice, what purpose it serves, what its intention is, and they can say yes or no to touch being something that they receive when working with us.
Yeah. And what might that look like? How can, as a yoga therapist, we be very clear that we have received informed consents from our students and clients?
Yeah. So I usually recommend that informed consent is both written and verbal. So you do want that written document that highlights, many things about your practice, including touch, if it's a part of your practice, so that the client signs off, they understand what they're signing up for. But then also a conversation. So I know in my practice, I will say, sometimes I might use a touch intervention in our sessions, if you're comfortable with that, which might look like me supporting your body in some way, or me placing a hand on your body in some way to draw your awareness there. What might that be like for you if touch were a part of our sessions? And that way we invite a dialogue. And I'm looking for non-coerced, enthusiastic consent, right? And so the client, because I'm the professional in the room, they might feel like they should just say yes. And so I'm looking for that too. So if they're like, oh yeah, that sounds okay, I'm seeing that body language. And I'm going to say hey, tell me more about that nonverbal reaction there. Let's talk about that. Some clients come in, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I've gone to yoga classes where they've used touch for adjustments. I love that. And other clients are not so sure or might have questions. And so really setting a foundation of, this does not have to be a part of our work. This is one possible thing that can be in our work. just like certain postures might not be a part of our work if they're not appropriate for that client's body, so same thing.
Yeah, it's good. I love that. I was doing some reading about enthusiastic affirmation and that whole sensory thing. And, it reminded me about Patanjali, because I'm, the Patanjali nerd. And it's, the definition of comprehension. How do we know something? And Patanjali says, comprehension is through direct sensory perception. And I was thinking about all those non-verbal cues, because we're looking to that, how is the person responding all over, and through inference and through reference. And I was thinking, the reference is like the written agreement, the clear statement, verbal agreement. But together it's not one thing, is it? Comprehension is a package of quite definable things that tells us, yes, we're on the same page here. And also, I think it's a good thing for us to mention that while we have this very comprehensive scope of professional practice, that also in our work, it's a good thing for us all to familiarise ourselves with our national or state laws wherever we are, because we're probably under other jurisdiction as well. And I must say, I spent some time, partly in preparation for this, looking through all the government things, and found all kinds of things that actually applied to what we'd say unregistered health professions or unlicensed health professions.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that not only is there consent on the front end, but there also needs to be ongoing consent, because your client might say like, oh yeah, I'm comfortable with touch. And I've had this happen with one of my clients. I work primarily with trauma survivors. And so, they have various experiences with touch and unsafe touch. And many of them come to me because they say like, I want to learn to experience safe touch. I want to reconnect with my body in these ways. And even if they're consenting to touch on the front end, I've had it happen in session where maybe I place my hand on the client's back and I immediately see them tense up. And so I'll remove my hand and I'll say like, tell me about what just happened. And then we might need to step back from using touch interventions. Like maybe that went over their edge, to use a Phoenix Rising term, or maybe not. And so.
Or you don't know till that moment. And it is that moment too, isn't it? I guess an aspect of consent, that it's contextual and in a moment too, that can be withdrawn at any time and change at any time, including minute to minute in the same session. We can't assume that consent's automatically there next time necessarily. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, we want our clients to feel empowered and to feel like they have body autonomy throughout our sessions.
Exactly. Yeah. Which probably leads to, as I say, in reflection, how do we feel overall that consented touch helps to create a safe environment, both for us as the yoga therapists and for the client during a yoga therapy session?
Yeah, so it helps the client, again, feel empowered and like they have body autonomy and like they understand what's going to happen in the session, and that they understand if they have consented to touch, that they understand what that touch will entail and look like. And it also means that we as the yoga therapists, we know that we are using interventions that the client understands and has consented to, because I know I certainly wouldn't want to do something that my client after the fact was like, I was not okay with that. That would feel terrible. And also, legally, it protects us as yoga therapists too, that we've had these conversations, that we can document that this conversation has occurred.
Yeah, and hearing you say that, you think, well, this is consistent of what is yoga anyway. It's about, our mind and understanding ourselves, isn't it? And being able to make choices and use tools for ourselves. So, every step along our therapeutic relationship is that empowerment, isn't it? As our definition of yoga therapy is about, self-empowerment, the student becoming autonomous and being in control of making choices with us helping them along the way. So it's very consistent to the environment that we're creating anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one other piece worth highlighting that I feel like should go without saying, but we should probably say it, is that, of course, the touch should always be non-sexual in nature. Your clients cannot consent to sexual touch with you. You know, that would be completely outside the scope of what should be occurring in yoga therapy.
Yeah, always. Yeah. As you know, there's overriding things about that, not only in the touch policy, but also in the scope of practice, isn't it? It's very, very clear.
Absolutely.
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Jenny Lee, and I hope that all our members have found this helpful today, and that we've got some really good clarity around the part of the scope of practice that is our touch consent.
Thank you, Leah.
Hi and welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'm here today with Zipporah. Hi, Zipporah.
Hi, Sarah.
We're here today to talk about trauma as it relates to the scope of practice in yoga therapy. And I really appreciate you being here, Zipporah, and want to start off with some basics. So right away, wondering, what are the fundamental differences between being trauma informed and trauma trained?
Yeah, so trauma informed, right? Being a practitioner who is trauma informed typically refers to your organizational or your professional culture and practice. So it is a set of guidelines, it's a framework, it's a lens that we use to kind of shape the culture within the system or the practice that we're working in. Trauma trained, however, is the application of specific clinical interventions that have been thoroughly researched and have been determined to be, full of evidence and efficacy to reduce symptoms of trauma and to facilitate recovery from trauma. So it is really the application of a specific clinical intervention, and the focus is to treat the symptoms of trauma. And some of the trauma, like some of those clinical interventions that I am referring to could be EMDR, right? So eye movement, desensitization, recovery. So that is a clinical intervention that's used to treat trauma, that has a very specific set of protocol that requires a lot of education and training. There's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. There's another protocol called seeking safety. And for example, there's another intervention that's called CPP, which is child-parent psychotherapy. So those are all evidence-based trauma-focused clinical interventions. So that would be what I would say.
So it sounds like trauma trained is even more specific, that a yoga therapist might also be a mental health therapist or have another advanced degree in addition to their yoga therapy certification in trauma training. And then trauma informed sounds like the cultural basis or like the environment, and then the interventions are coming from that trauma training. And so that's really interesting. What are those basic principles for incorporating some of that trauma informed care, that environmental support, as you were saying?
So, so this is coming from the Institute on Trauma and Trauma Informed Care from SAMHSA, which is a national organization on substance abuse and mental health. There's really 5 guiding principles that we use to provide a framework for providing care, right, through a trauma-informed lens, because it's going to hopefully reduce the risk of re-traumatizing our clients. And so the idea is that they're generalizable and they can be interpreted and applied across settings. So those would be safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, right? So those are like 5 principles that we can think of when we are when we're designing the environments that we're going to be providing care to our clients in, everything from the intake process to your website to what's the first thing, who is the first person that clients see when they walk in the door. So all of those are guiding principles.
It sounds like, Zipporah, that in order to create that environment, we can be informed by some evidence-based best practices in terms of providing things like safety and choices and trustworthiness. And that for a yoga therapist, providing that environment is really important. While a yoga therapist, unless otherwise having that additional background and degree, would probably not use those interventions, but could definitely provide a trauma-informed environment for their clients, regardless of knowing whether or not those clients actually are holding a trauma or not.
Right, right. And I think another thing to keep in mind too, when we are as yoga therapists, when we're, when we're thinking about how we're going to deliver care, one of the things to keep in mind is that because the prevalence of trauma is so high in our country, I mean, I think I think statistics tell us that at about 70% of the adult population in this country is living with some kind of trauma from their past, their history. So in a way, we want to be providing care as if every person walking in our door is a trauma survivor.
Wow, yeah, I can see that that's important. So what, I mean, and I heard you say like re-traumatizing, and to assume that everyone may be carrying some form of trauma within them. And so what does it look like to avoid those re-traumatizations, and what does it look like, when we're sensitive or not to the possibility of those traumas within our practice?
Yeah. And so, systems that aren't practicing like with that trauma informed care, there's some things that I think there are some red flags, right? So to speak. And it's important to keep in mind, like as a yoga therapist, regardless of whether you're working independently or, a lot of people are working within larger systems like, hospitals, healthcare systems. And it's important to remember that it's not just the clients, but it's also the staff too, right? And so one of the things, staff are also highly traumatized. And if you think about just like an example from our, current situation, healthcare workers are extremely traumatized right now, going into work every day, in the midst of this pandemic situation. But what we can see sometimes in these systems, there's often misuse, overuse of power. There can be a much higher rate of staff burnout and turnover. Staff can have like really low morale, kind of seem apathetic, right? Clients also report feeling really disempowered and devalued. Clients are often within a system that is lacking trauma sensitivity. A lot of the time clients are pathologized, they're labeled. Sometimes there's coercive type interventions that are used to kind of manipulate clients into being what we would call treatment compliant. Providers can be dismissive, right? So we want to make sure we're not being dismissive. And we also want to make sure that we're always considering a survivor's perspective into the intake, into the whole assessment and treatment planning process. And a system that lacks trauma informed care and sensitivity may not be seeing the influence of racism and poverty and intergenerational exposure to trauma, because those systems often show up in how a person is presenting, right? And so if you're not practicing from that trauma informed lens, it's very easy to miss that and then to further pathologize the person, which contributes to the re-traumatization. We also want to keep in mind that we want to consider a client's voice, right, in all aspects of care. And sometimes a system that lacks trauma sensitivity is going to be focusing too much on what's wrong versus what has happened to that person. So those are some things to keep in mind.
Wow, it sounds like what we can really do is show up, be present, be open, engaging more of an unconditional positive regard for that client.
Yeah.
Giving them that space to be themselves as human beings without perhaps the labels that they might know as part of their diagnoses in the other systems.
Right.
It sounds like as yoga therapists too, we have an inherent responsibility to learn about these systems and the way these systems can harm or even perpetuate harms historically within our society, and to really be aware of how that works among different bodies in our world. And so you talked about some things like listening, how important that voice is for the survivor. And that is probably one strategy for implementing and ensuring a trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practice. And so are there other simple strategies that we can implement as yoga therapists that provide more safety, more trustworthiness, more choice for our clients, and provide that trauma-informed space?
Yeah, there are really simple things you can do, right? And, I always say growth does not happen overnight, right? So the expectation is not that by tomorrow morning, your entire practice is, kind of rebuilt from this yoga informed lens. But these are little things that you can start to be creating more self awareness around and self reflexivity. And so there are some really simple things you can do. One of which is always comes to mind is this idea of safety, right? Take a look at your intake forms, right? So whatever intake forms you are giving out to clients when they want to work with you, one thing that you can just look at is, do you have multiple boxes to check for gender? Right. So do you just have male or female? I know the other day I filled out a form to have a COVID test done, and it was just male or female. And my first thought was, this is not, right off the bat, this wouldn't be safe for a person who is gender fluid or gender non-binary. So just look at those boxes. Do you have other options for gender? Look at your website, right? Is your website really clear? Is it user friendly? Because if your website is really cluttered and it's hard for people to find information, that can be really re-triggering for somebody. How are you ensuring privacy, right? Things like that. If you're doing yoga therapy via telehealth platform, is it HIPAA compliant? Is it safe? Is it secure? Another thing is, are your clients being clearly informed about their rights and responsibilities, right, in all of your intake paperwork? How are you establishing boundaries with your clients, right? How are you ensuring confidentiality? How are you speaking about confidentiality? And creating an environment where clients feel validated and affirmed. So like all of these things, I think are simple, simple strategies that you can implement pretty quickly. But I always say start with the paperwork, because oftentimes those are some of the first things people see when they come to you, is the paperwork on your website and the language on your website,
Yeah. It seems like those first points of contact with the client are like the website, the paperwork. Those are the very first places that we can really bring our attention to as yoga therapists and ask ourselves, Are we here, being inclusive? Are we allowing people to show up as they are? Or are our forms, is our initial presentation inherently saying, no, you do not belong? And that belonging and the retriggering of trauma and the relationship there is something that I'm hearing in your share right now. And so those kind of things, but then also just, I hear you highlight confidentiality. And it just goes back to that trustworthiness and that safety. And it seems to be that those two things are just really, very important, paramount to providing that trauma-informed space along with choice.
Yeah.
Wow. Anything else you might have to share with our field of yoga therapists for the sake of working with trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, trauma-trained lens?
I think that just the one thing I want to say really is just how important it is, right? To, the trauma trained, right? Like that's one thing that can come, right? If you want to become fully trained in a specific modality, I encourage you to do so, right? It just seek it out, research it, talk to people who practice, and definitely pursue, right, training if you feel so called to do so. But being trauma informed is something that you can start doing right now, right? It doesn't take years and years of training. It doesn't take large, financial investments to do. There are tons of resources out there, that kind of create, right, templates that offer pillars, and just like these things like safety and choice and empowerment, right? Like things that you can do starting right now. And that's kind of what I love about this whole concept, is that all healthcare providers can benefit from being trauma informed, right? And it really starts with us, as the providers, to be making these spaces more inclusive and more and more, I would say safe, but also brave for people, right? So it really starts with us, and it starts like it's something you can do this afternoon, right? If you can start looking at your intake paperwork like right now and start making things just look a little bit more inclusive, right? And less alienating.
Well said, Zipporah. So much. I really appreciate your time and your attention with this. And thanks for being here and learning a little bit about the scope of practice and as it relates to trauma and yoga therapy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Shara Carruthers, and I'm a C-IAYT certified yoga therapist, a certified Ayurvedic practitioner, and an ERYT 500 level yoga teacher. And in this video, I will be discussing the IAYT guidelines for lifestyle and nutrition scope of practice. And so if you're a yoga therapist who provides or would like to provide lifestyle and nutrition advice to your clients, this video is going to detail the current IAYT guidelines for scope of practice as it relates to lifestyle and nutrition advice. I'm going to talk to you about the IAYT recommendations for what you can and can't do under these guidelines. And then finally, I'm going to talk with you about the factors to consider when determining how these guidelines actually apply to you. So let's first start with looking at what the current guidelines tell us. And with respect to nutrition and lifestyle advice, the current IAYT guidelines state that a yoga therapist is qualified to include yoga practices such as yogic lifestyle and dietary advice according to the yoga therapy framework, education in yoga philosophy, and other practices in the yoga tradition and for which the therapist has received appropriate education and training. And in this situation, dietary advice here refers to a couple of things. It refers to advice relating to foods that may support or hinder a client's progress towards well-being. And it also refers to advice that's in accordance with the tradition in which you're trained. But it's important to recognize here that dietary advice does not include prescribing of herbs or other nutritional supplements, nor does it imply that you're a nutritionist or an Ayurvedic practitioner unless you actually have those qualifications. Further, the current guidelines state that a yoga therapist is qualified to provide guidance for lifestyle changes to create improved health and well-being according to the yoga therapy framework provided in your yoga therapy training. All right, so what does all of this mean? What do the guidelines actually mean? Well, first, it's important to realize that the guidelines, they're somewhat broad. And the reason for that is that they acknowledge the range of areas of focus and expertise that are represented by the yoga therapy profession, as well as by the individual programs of study and the individual practitioners. And so these guidelines are recommending that in general, yoga therapists cannot provide nutritional therapy to treat disease. They cannot promote or provide medications. Yoga therapists cannot suggest drastic caloric restriction or diagnose or treat an eating disorder. Yoga therapists cannot create or prescribe specific meal plans as a nutritionist might do. And they cannot prescribe lifestyle or diet-based practices such as detoxes or colon cleanses. They cannot prescribe herbal supplements or remedies, and they cannot go against the recommendations of a healthcare professional. However, suitably qualified therapists can provide information and insights regarding the components of a yogic diet. They can provide general seasonal lifestyle and diet information. They can provide guidance regarding the potential health benefits of various components of a yogic diet. They can also provide general information related to yogic eating philosophy, like mitahara. So in other words, things like portion sizing, meal timing, and food qualities, all in alignment with a yogic eating philosophy. Yoga therapists, suitably qualified yoga therapists, can provide accountability and support to their clients, and they can share reputable and helpful resources for clients to discuss with their medical team. And so with all that said, how do you determine your specific scope of practice? Well, as I mentioned before, these guidelines, they reflect C-IAYT's recognition of the fact that yoga therapy encompasses a really broad range of knowledge and skills and areas of focus, all under the umbrella of the practice of yoga therapy. And the individual therapists are also going to vary very broadly in terms of their academic and professional backgrounds and their areas of expertise. And many therapists, individual therapists, actually do hold qualifications in other health and wellness related fields. And so first and foremost, it's important to work within the scope of your specific knowledge. So what is the basis of your lifestyle and nutrition knowledge? These are questions to ask yourself. Have you gained a suitable and relevant knowledge to provide professional support in the area of nutrition and lifestyle? It's important to work within your specific scope of skills. So what skills and experience do you have in providing education and guidance around diet and lifestyle? And is your level of experience and competency sufficient to provide professional level advice or support? It's also important to work within the scope of your specific training. In other words, what additional trainings and in what additional ways are you trained for this work in terms of lifestyle and nutrition? Have you gained qualifications through your yoga therapy studies or otherwise relevant to providing professional nutrition and lifestyle advice and support? And finally, it's also really important to remember that regardless of your skills or your knowledge or your qualifications, different jurisdictions, in other words, different states or counties or provinces, or even countries, may have specific requirements related to the provision of diet and lifestyle advice and guidance. And so it's really important to know what the options are, where you live and where you practice, as those guidelines, they may actually impact the scope of the services that you can offer. And so I hope all of this has been useful in clarifying the existing guidelines and answering any questions that you may actually have about the provision of lifestyle and nutrition advice in accordance with IAYT's guidelines and recommendations. Thanks for listening.
So Laura, welcome. I'm really happy you were able to do this little interview with us on scope of practices. So welcome.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks, C-IAYT, for inviting me.
Not at all. It's our pleasure. So we're talking about business practices. So my first question to you, what are the 3 most important steps to take in building a yoga therapy business? And let's take them one at a time and give our viewers some wise advice about how they might implement your suggestions while honoring the scope of practice.
Sure. Yeah, great question. So, the first thing is to make sure you have what I'll call like a really good offer, that you have something you can put out in the world that will help people and that will really help, reduce suffering, will help alleviate some pain. So you're not overpromising anything, but you need to offer something that people will pay for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second, you need to be able to articulate the value of that offer. So this is about messaging. So what I see or tend to see a lot of with newer yoga therapists is sort of vague sometimes and or has a lot of yoga speak in it. Like, I help people live their most vital, balanced, joyful, healthy, chakra aligned lifestyles. And people frankly are not Googling that. People are like, I have back pain or I'm having a hard time in menopause. So not only do you need to have sort of the skills to be able to serve and help others, but you need to be able to let them know succinctly that you have those skills.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you need to be able to spread the word, right? So it doesn't do anyone any good if, I'm really good at helping people feel better while they're going through cancer treatment. And I know how to say that succinctly and accurately, truthfully. But if I'm not letting other people know about it, then it doesn't help anyone. So that last piece is kind of what, the part of marketing that a lot of people shy away from. But really all we're doing is letting people who already have a problem that they need solved know that we are a possible solution.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to force the solution on them, but we just need to let them know, like, hey, here's an option. If your situation matches what I can offer, then we should talk. So
and in clear, understandable language.
Yes. Okay. And that's and maybe we'll circle back around to it, because I think people or we can talk about it now. I think there's this thing about feeling like you don't want to overpromise, right, with the messaging. So it's very different to say, I help people who are going through cancer treatment feel better, right, while they're going through treatment. That's really different. That's saying what I do. Those are my skills. That's really different than saying, I promise you that you won't be nauseous while going through cancer treatment if you work with me, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I might be a French teacher, but I can't promise you you're going to have a great accent or memorize the vocabulary, right? Or, So keep the focus on what you do well, but don't promise a certain set of results.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. Now, can you share some information on what is a referral list and what is the best way to build one?
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked this, because this is actually a wonderful way not only to grow your own business, but to better serve your clients by becoming part of sort of a safety net, like a web of service providers, so that your clients feel like they're supported by a whole community of people. So the best way to go about this is really from a place of service. Like, how can I help others? You know, how can I help other practitioners who, I'll just use the example of cancer survivors because that's my specialty too. How can I better serve the whole community that is being touched by cancer? So the way I approach it, the way I would recommend other people approach it, is first of all to do some research for your referral list. For example, I know that a lot of people going through cancer treatment often get acupuncture because that can help a lot with the side effects. Mm-hmm. So rather than just Googling acupuncturists in your town and then calling every single one and saying, hey, you know, I'm a yoga therapist who works with cancer survivors. I'd love to tell you about what I do. My first step is researching the other acupuncturists, all the acupuncturists, to see who I feel most aligned with. So I'm actually going to take the time to really read their websites, to subscribe to their newsletters, to read their blog posts, to follow them on social media. So I have a really good feeling of how they work, who they serve. And a lot of times it's just that intuitive gut hit, like, yeah, I would love to get to know you. And then I would contact that person. And the way I would phrase it is, you know, hi, I'm Laura Cooperman, and I'm a yoga therapist. I work with cancer survivors. I know you do too. I would love to, you know, I'd love to get together and learn more about what you do and see if there's a way we can mutually support each other and mutually support our clients.
And how do you, or what is the best way as a yoga therapist for you to talk with your client about the possibility or the a practical reason for a referral? Like, when would it occur between a therapist and a client?
Yes, that's great. So anytime it's outside of your scope of practice, right? What have you been trained on? What do you know you can do safely? And I like to have, you know, a PDF or something where all my referrals are kind of in one place. And first of all, I talk to my client. So if my client, for example, is talking about having excessive nausea and excessive sort of, you know, digestive distress while going through cancer treatment, I'm going to ask them, you know, have you talked to your doctor about it? What are they doing? Are you taking any medication for it? Because there's probably a story there that's beneficial for us to know. Oh, I was on these meds that helped, but then they also had these negative side effects and I couldn't sleep. Well, they should talk to their doctor. So before we swoop in and say, oh, you must see a nutritionist, gather some more information. What have they tried? What haven't they tried? Should they go back to their doctor? Should they go back to their nutritionist? Do they need help articulating what they need? That's something we can hear them out on and maybe strategize with them. But if they, you know, if they really haven't tried anything, I would say, you know, oh, is this something that's bothering you enough that you would like to see someone about it? So they are making that choice. I'm not necessarily just telling them what to do. Yep. And then you can give them your list, your referral list. Yeah, exactly. No pressure.
No pressure. Thank you. And let's talk a minute about sales. For instance, what factors does a yoga therapist need to take into consideration if they're selling products and services in order to make sure that that's ethical?
Yes, so that's a great question, because a lot of us are sort of like hyphenates, right? Like, I'm a yoga therapist / jewelry maker / I sell essential oils and I make mandalas, so a lot of us have multiple skill sets. So remember that our initial engagement with our client is for a particular service or a particular set of services that we've agreed on, we've discussed with them, that we believe are going to address the situation that they're coming to us for. Mm-hmm. So this means if I'm working with someone who is going through cancer treatment, I'm not in the back of my mind thinking, how can I sell her some neti pots, mm-hmm. even if I have these amazing handmade ceramic neti pots that I make. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you want to stick to that agreement. And really there's, later on, maybe we can talk about some resources. There's some great books and resources that I have that also talk about making sure you're only selling what that initial engagement is for. Mm-hmm. Unless the client really specifically asks, so, okay, I know that this particular essential oil helps with nausea, helps with anxiety. Mm-hmm. We've already agreed in our sessions that the client is very interested in using essential oils as part of her home practice. If she asks me, oh, I love this essential oil, it really helps me relax, is this something you sell? Mm-hmm. Sure, absolutely.
Absolutely, we're letting the client do the lead in. And thank you very much for those very important thoughts and very timely thoughts. We appreciate your presence very much today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me back.
After watching the video, don't forget the quiz. The next steps are to take the quiz to obtain the CE credit. This is required for recertification. Go to the website, CIAYT.org, and from the top education menu, choose Professional Development, Ethics Trainings, and click on the quiz link for the ethics video number 2, Scope of Practice. After passing the quiz, 1 CE credit will be automatically added to your profile. You can also find additional information on the website, such as the Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibilities, Scope of Practice for Yoga Therapy, the grounds for disciplinary action, the procedures for disciplinary action, and the Ethics and Disciplinary Review Panel. Gratitude goes to the Ethics Training Task Force volunteers and CIAYT staff members for your time and creativity, and the 5 additional CIAYT volunteers for lending your time and expertise. And of course, all CIAYTs for your commitment to staying within your scope of practice for yoga therapy. Thank you for watching.